and welcome to today's webinar, the Dewey Divas Reader's Advisory on New Titles. Our presenters today are the Dewey Divas, Saffron Beckwith and Susan Wallace. Saffron is Vice President at Ampersand, where she has the best job in the world, talking about books with teachers and librarians. She is also an instructor at Ryerson University. Susan began her publishing career as a bookseller at Toronto's Book City before becoming a sales rep at the Literacy Press Group. 3 years ago, she moved to Oxford University Press, but has been a member of the Dewey Divas since 2003. Susan's favorite types of books to read and listen to on CD are literary fiction and biography. Participants may communicate during the webinar by using the online chat feature. Look for the speech bubble in the top right-hand corner. You may also ask questions throughout the webinar. Please click on the hand icon, which you can see there, to raise your hand. It's really important to mute your phones as this session is being recorded. Please use *6 to mute your phone. To ask a question, press *6 to unmute, although I would ask you to first raise your hand if you do have a question. And with the speech bubble, you can notice at the bottom of it, if you press the bubble, you select to all, and if you type in your question there, it'll show up on that screen. So welcome, Saffron and Susan.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having us. We've done, I think, the second time we've done a webinar with you, and we really appreciate it. We, as was mentioned, we are two, I think, of 8 Dewey Divas. The rest of our lists are for the spring and from previous seasons are all on our website at Dewey Divas. What is it called? Blogspot? I don't know. Yeah. Dewey Divas Blogspot, and we're also on Pinterest, which has been really tearing up a storm the past few weeks, so somebody's pinning us. And we're also on Facebook and Twitter, of course. So and we have a lot of fun doing what we're doing, and we're very excited to talk to you about our new books. So we both are working with mostly adult titles. I've thrown in a couple of YA titles that can really translate for or transition for adult readers as well. So the first book I wanted to talk about is a slender volume. I kind of like short books because you get lots more to read. You can read them quite quickly. But this one is very interesting. It's from the first time that he's been seriously published in North America. He's considered one of the world's greatest writers, but is really not quite that well known here in North America. He has fantastic quotes from David Mitchell, Michelle Faber, A.S. Byatt, I can't pronounce that. Is it Juano Diaz? Is that how you say his name? Yeah. So just a fantastic writer. And this is one of 3 books that FSG is going to be publishing this season to really launch him in North America. And it's essentially sort of a bit of a magical realist tale of a sailor on a ship from 1949, and these tales are being told. And you're not quite sure if these people really are who they say they are, but it really is quite a lyrical fantasy, and as I said, it's quite slender to read. And I read it basically in one night. It was very, very interesting. So a really new author to introduce your readers to, and I think that you will find it very intriguing.
Hi everybody, this is Susan. So my first title is The Flower of the Empire. And one of the reasons I like this book is because it covers so many different things. It's a history, it's about architecture, it's about horticulture. And the story begins in the 1830s when a horticulturalist brought this giant Amazonian lily to England, and it was from South America. And at this time there was a huge interest in gardening in England, and a lot of public gardens were being created, for instance Kew Gardens, and this new plant was in high demand. The flowers were huge and they only bloomed once a year, and they were spectacular. They were sort of this glowing white, you can see it on the cover, and they only lasted 2 days. On the first day they were white, and then overnight they'd turn pink, and then they'd die. And the lily pads were enormous. I actually have a picture. So the lily pads were about 6 feet across, and they could support about 80 or 90 pounds. So there was this gardener, a professional gardener named Joseph Paxton, and he was quite successful at growing these. But he was also an amateur architect, and he used the lily pads to inspire the design in his greenhouses. So I also have a picture, another picture. This is the underside of these giant lily pads, and you can see these veins. They're actually hollow, and that's why it floats, but they also make it really strong. So he was inspired by this structure to build greenhouses, and they kept getting bigger and more elaborate. And eventually he was invited to submit a design for the Great Exhibition in London in 1851. And he's the one who designed the Crystal Palace. And that's the picture that's on the cover. The Crystal Palace was enormous. It was about 900,000 square feet, and it had 1,400 booths. So like I said, this covers so many different things: horticulture, architecture, history of the Victorian era, and there are also 16 pages of beautiful color illustrations.
So the next book I wanted to talk about is nonfiction. We're all familiar with Bountiful in BC, and certainly what has been happening down in the States as well with Mr. Jeff. This is also happening here in Ontario, and I was totally unfamiliar with this story. Essentially, this is the story of Carol Christie, who was part of what we would consider a cult. And she was basically in there for over 40 years. And this cult resides in Owen Sound and has been operating quite successfully in the printing industry here in Ontario and up in their own community. So much like what has happened in Bountiful, there is a single man who runs this cult and marries many of the women in there, and then when the women have children, they mostly make sure that the boys leave this organization. So after 40 years and giving birth to 2 children, she decided that she was going to leave. And so this is the story of her life there and the struggle for her to leave. On a good note, there is a successful happy ending to the story that I wanted to point out, is that she has been remarried. She left in 2008. She was able to leave with one of her sons, but unfortunately the other one chose to remain behind. This has already been on W5. It was on W5 in November, and when the book is going to be coming out, W5 will be doing a follow-up presentation on this. So it was a bit shocking to read this. I had absolutely no idea, but she's a really intriguing writer, and it does have a happy ending.
Okay, the complete journals of Ellen Montgomery. So last season we published the complete journals from 1889 to 1900, and that covered her younger years while she was in school. This covers late 20s into her late 30s, and this is a much more interesting time for Ellen Montgomery. At the beginning, she's working as a copy editor in Halifax, and but she soon moved home to Cavendish PEI to care for her recently widowed grandmother. And so because she was at home, she had more time to write, and this is when she started to write Anne of Green Gables. And in fact, during this 10-year period, she wrote 4 novels. There's a lot of information here about writing Anne of Green Gables. She writes about Anne as if she's a real person. She also talks about where she got her ideas for the book. A lot of the incidents are from her own life, and the people and the places, she takes those from her surroundings. She also writes about her relationship with her publisher, and her publisher really took advantage of her not really knowing the business. She writes also about being the fame that came, and it came quite immediately after publishing Anne of Green Gables. And there were parts of it she enjoyed, like meeting other authors and traveling, but she really didn't like interacting with her fans. Another interesting part of this, she meets her husband, or her future husband. They were engaged for quite a long time, but that's an interesting aspect. And an important piece is depression. She writes a lot about her feelings of depression. And the selected journals were published in the 1980s, and at that time all of that information was taken out. There was nothing about depression. So now we have the complete journals. The last few entries in here are actually written on her honeymoon, and that's interesting too, because she's really starting to think, and this is only in the first couple of days, that she made the wrong choice. She was an avid writer. She loved to take pictures, and there are 300 pictures in this book, and I have one here. This is my favorite page of pictures. She took a picture of herself in each of the different outfits she owned. So that's a really fun aspect of the book, all the pictures of her relatives, the places she lived. The first book was really well received, and the Globe and Mail picked it as one of the top 100 books of 2012.
So The One-Way Bridge by Kathy Peltier. I was not familiar with Kathy Peltier, and when this book was announced at our sales conference, a number of the reps squealed with delight. They're like, "Oh, a new Kathy Peltier!" So she hasn't written anything in over 6 years. So I was intrigued because I really respect what my fellow reps have to say. And as soon as I got my hands on a copy of this book, I absolutely dove right in. So it's a really fun look at a town, and again, you may be familiar with her, but she's getting back to the town of Madagash, which she has talked about or written about in previous of her books. And essentially, it's a seemingly quiet New England town, but it's filled with the amount of characters in this book that is, just over 300 pages. There's just somebody for everybody. There's mailmen, there's teachers, there's Vietnam vets. It's a real inside look at what is seemingly, a very quaint little town, but there's got a bit of a dark underbelly. And that dark underbelly is one of humor. This is not necessarily a dark book. There is a body in the book at some point, but it's quite a comic book. So, and again, this is someone else that has just got these enormous amount of fans. Wally Lamb is a huge fan of hers. Fanny Flagg from Fried Green Tomatoes calls her rare talent. Richard Russo, Chuck Barris, Alistair MacLeod. Kathy herself is a part-time Canadian. She lived a number of her years up in the eastern townships of Quebec. So again, for people who enjoy things like Fried Green Tomatoes or She's Come Undone, I think they'll really, really enjoy this. And you gotta love the cover.
So the next book is Philosophy Bites Back, and this is based on a very popular website called Philosophy Bites. And if you go to the website, you'll see that it's got podcasts, and you can download these podcasts, and they're interviews with different philosophers. Most of these philosophers are professors at universities in Britain or the U.S., and there are a few Canadians. So what this book is, it includes 12 transcribed interviews. And in this book, all of these philosophers have been asked the same question, and that is, who is your favorite philosopher? 205 people were asked, and the most popular answer was David Hume. About 20% gave that answer. So he's one of the philosophers they talk about, but all the other ones, they're all covering different historical philosophers. Each one's about 10 pages long, and these have a very conversational feel. They usually start off with a little conversation about the background, sort of a biography about the philosopher, and then they talk about the main idea that this philosopher is known for. And they're talking about all the main ones that I've heard of, or you've heard of: Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. So this is really a basic book. It's meant as an introduction to philosophy, but it's very engaging, very accessible. And another great thing about it is that it's got 3 pages at the back for further reading recommendations. So there is another book, and I put that at the bottom. It's just called Philosophy Bites, and those are interviews about a variety of different topics. That was the first book.
So the next book I want to talk about is a graphic novel from Guy Delisle. So Guy has written a number of other books: Burma, Pyongyang, Shenzhen, and Jerusalem was his last book. So his wife is a doctor with Médecins Sans Frontières. So this is why he and his wife have been traveling all over the world to these not really tourist-friendly, shall we say, locations. And what this book is totally, absolutely polar opposite to any of those books. And while, if you've read the other books, you will have noticed in a lot of the places, because he is a stay-at-home dad while his wife is off in the jungles or in places that nobody knows where she is, and he is at home looking after the 2 kids. So what he has done is, alongside with those other books that he has written, he's basically collected what is essentially a journal of his parenting whilst he has been a stay-at-home dad. And it is hilarious. I think the cover conveys it all. One of the stories is about his son has lost his tooth, and so he promises his son, put your tooth under the pillow and a mouse will come and leave you some money. So his son trots off to bed, and then his son wakes up in the morning, but lo and behold, of course, Dad has forgotten to do so. So he says, oh, don't worry, put it under again, and no worries, or you will absolutely get some money tomorrow. So sure enough, Guy falls right back to sleep on the couch the next day while watching television and totally forgets to put the tooth under the pillow. So the following day, he's like determined to do it, and sure enough, he manages to stay awake longer than his son, puts €1 under the pillow, and then when his son wakes up, his son is so excited to see the euro. But his son still has some questions. His son says, Dad, how are you sure there really is such thing as a mouse that comes and leaves the euro under your pillow? And Guy's response is, of course, you don't think your parents would forget 2 nights in a row to put money under your pillow. So that story actually took longer for me to tell than it did to read. And it's a fairly substantial book. It's it's only about 120 pages, but really fun, and it's sort of like the outtakes, basically, of his other books, but all fun. There's no guns, there's no, terrible governments here, so there you go. Oh, there's some of his illustrations.
So Oxford has a lot of, we have a lot of biography books this season, so that's great. That's one of my favorite things to read. This is a biography for people who who want to read books about business. This is a book about John Jacob Braska, a very innovative financier who helped to shape modern capitalism. He was a guy who walked fast, talked fast, and he was famous for the large number of speeding tickets he collected. He was born in 1879 in a small town in New York State, and when he was barely out of his teens, he became a personal assistant to Pierre DuPont, and very quickly he moved into the position of being his partner, and the two took over the family business and turned DuPont into one of the biggest companies in the world. Then in about 12 years later, in 1914, Raskob saw that General Motors was kind of shaky and about to go under, and he persuaded everybody at DuPont to sink a lot of money into General Motors. They bought up almost half the company. And so then he was VP of GM and also VP at DuPont at the same time. And he was trying to come up with ideas about how to sell cars. And he said, well, why don't we offer direct financing to all our customers? And then this will help us sell more cars, and they can pay us back every month. And everybody thought this was a crazy idea, but of course, now that's how a lot of people buy cars. he also promoted the idea of ordinary people buying stocks so that they could save for their retirement. And again, a lot of his ideas are just commonplace now. So when he was at GM in the 20s, he had a big fight with the president of General Motors, and he cashed out all his shares, and he used that money to build the Empire State Building. Apparently he met with a group of architects, and he held up a pencil and he said, "I want you to build a building that looks like this. Build it as tall as you can without it toppling over." So I've really given you just a few pieces of his life, but it's very accessible. You don't have to know a lot about business, but because he had so many ideas that we use now, it really is a very interesting biography.
So the next book is from Lawrence Hill, and it's, we've got a spelling mistake on there, sorry. Dear Sir, I intend to burn your book. So this book is from a series called the Cressel series, and it's much like the Massey lecture series, but it's held at the University of Alberta. And they published, people who have spoken in this have been Annabelle Leon and Eden Robinson, and now this year's guest lecturer was Lawrence Hill. So this book is amazing, and every library should absolutely read this. Where the title comes from is from when Lawrence Hill published his book, The Book of Negroes. And of course, as we have heard, that there has been quite a lot of some people got quite upset about using the word Negro in the cover, which of course, as we know, is from a historical document. That was what that document was called. In the U.S., they changed the title to where somebody knows your name, and it was kind of a bit of a failure. The cover didn't look that great. Anyway, the title was translated directly in many parts of the rest of the world, and the response was quite heated. And in fact, Lawrence Hill did get a letter, and the beginning of the letter was, "Dear Sir, I intend to burn your book." So essentially what this essay is looking at Lawrence Hill's position on censorship, the impact that censorship has on discourse, and how damaging it can be to a society. So he talks, for example, that, certainly on the left, where he puts himself, people would want to ban or not carry a book such as Little Black Sambo, which is considered a fairly racist text. But on the right, then you also have groups that are equally wanting to ban books like Mom and Mom Got Married, because that's about gay parents. So he really talks a lot in this book about censorship. He talks a lot about the importance of libraries in this ecosystem. It's a really great read, and again, I think every library should have a copy. He's going to be out there. We're almost sold out of the initial print run on this. We're excited to say he's going to be on Q in a couple of weeks talking about this book, and he's just getting geared up.
So the next book is about Antarctica. As recent as the 1700s, Antarctica was kind of a mythic place because people still weren't sure if it existed or not. Captain James Cook, he tried twice to find it, but gave up because of the ice and the heavy fog. It wasn't discovered until 1820, and that was by Russian sailing ships. And they didn't get out and walk around. They just saw this continent, and the captain raised a toast and proclaimed that this land belonged to Russia, and he named it Peter I Island. At approximately the same time, in a different area, the British were laying claim to Antarctica at the same time, and they were laying down these boards painted with the Union Jack. Over the last 200 years, 12 different countries have laid claim to Antarctica, everybody from Chile to Argentina to the U.S. and New Zealand. And in the 1970s, several different cities tried to, several different countries tried to lay claim by starting little towns. but nothing has really lasted because of the hostile weather. This book is great because it's a thorough history. There are also several mini-biographies about all the explorers and scientists, and currently there are about 4,000 people living there, mostly at research stations.
So my next book, Flee, Fly, Flown, can be, it's a fiction book, and it can be summed up as a Canadian Thelma and Louise with Alzheimer's. So essentially it also really reminded me also of the 100-year-old man who broke a window and disappeared. In terms of, it starts out with two women that are older women that both have Alzheimer's, but they're just at the beginning stages of it, and they've decided that they no longer want to be in their home, and that's certainly in the home that they're in, and it's certainly not how they want to end their lives. So they literally break out and they go steal a car and have a fantastic road trip across Canada. So they end up picking up a hitchhiker who you're not too sure of his intentions initially, but it turns out things go well in the end. And this book has been getting some very good reviews. This is Janet's first novel. And she really treats her author, like there's a lot of humor in this book, but she really treats her authors with quite a bit of respect, and but there is a lot of humor in this book as well. So really enjoyed this, and I think this, with a really pretty cover, I think it will appeal to a lot of your patrons.
Children of Henry VIII. So Henry VIII had 4 children, each by a different wife. First there was Mary in 1516. A couple of years later there was Henry Fitzroy, who was illegitimate. And apparently there's not a lot written about him because he was illegitimate and he just lived into his teen years. I didn't realize that Fitzroy was the name given to the illegitimate children of English royalty. Anyways, 14 years would pass before Elizabeth, and then following that there was Edward. You'll notice on the cover there are 3 children when he actually had 4. This is a painting from the 1540s, the early 1540s, and that's after the first son had already passed away. There's still lots of interest in the Tudors. Wolf Hall, there's an example. Also the Tudors, the TV series, that wasn't that long ago. And there's lots of books about Henry VIII, but not many about his children. Oh, it's full of pictures. There's, 16 pages of color.
A lot of the books that I'm talking about, I never really sort of sit back or stand back and take a look at all of the books until I do a presentation, and this is the first presentation that Susan, the Deweys have really done. And I'm starting to realize I have a lot of funny books. Yay!
Yeah, it's about time.
It's about time! And this book is hysterical. Free Magic Secrets Revealed. So Mark Liren Young, he is the theater critic for the Vancouver Sun, and in 2009 he won the Leacock for humor. So he's double stamped as a very funny guy. This is his memoir from his final year of high school, sort of 1979, 1980, and how he abandons all hope really of graduating in order to basically join up with a couple of other guys and to start this magic show. So there's so many, pretty much every other chapter I think or every other paragraph I just laughed out loud. But as he starts out the book, he says, like all great adventures, this one started with somebody trying to get laid. So these 3 guys, they decide, how are we going to get some hot chicks? And what we're going to do is put on the best magic show ever. And it really ramps up quite a bit because they have a cousin of one of the guys is a promoter with a group called Rainbow that brought acts, like real acts such as Rush and toured, big bands all across Canada. And also, this was right at the time when Doug Henning was really sort of exploding onto the scene. So it's really, really funny. And reading it, you just can't believe. I didn't have this freedom as a 16 or 17-year-old, but they certainly, seem to have a lot more freedom than I ever did. So, anyways, lots and lots of fun.
So the next book is Canada and the End of the Imperial Dream. This is about Beverly Baxter. He was born in Toronto in 1891, and as a young man he sold pianos. He was very successful, but he always had this dream of becoming a writer. Eventually he went to Europe to fight in World War I, and afterwards he stayed in England and he pursued a career in journalism. He was hired by Lord Beaverbrook, and that's who's on the cover alongside Winston Churchill. Lord Beaverbrook, he was another transplanted Canadian, and he owned several newspapers, and he gave Beverly Baxter his first job. And he really backed him and was such a strong supporter. He introduced him to all the right people and really advanced his career. He was hired to write at the Daily Express, and this was in 1920. And eventually he became the editor-in-chief. In 1936 he left and became a member of Parliament in England. And it was around this time that he started writing for Maclean's in Canada. So he was living in England, he was an MP in England, but he was writing these letters. He had a regular column for Maclean's, and the column was called Letters from London. And he wrote this column for 25 years, and it was really popular. And this was how a lot of Canadians found out what was going on in the world. He was a real insider because he'd worked at these papers. He knew all the actors, the writers, and because he was a politician, he also knew everybody, all the politicians in Canada and England. He was always back and forth between the two countries. There's lots of information in here about the history of Maclean's and lots of pictures of the old covers. Maclean's actually had several different names. It was first called the Busy Man's Magazine. This book is not actually a collection of his columns. It's a history book, but it's the history of the 20th century as experienced by one man. And as I said, he was connected to everybody. And he was even connected to the royal court. And one of his most famous pieces was about the abdication of Edward VIII. This has got 8 pages of black and white pictures, and Maclean's Magazine is going to do a feature on this book.
So another funny book we have from a debut author, Allie Bryan. She's what we call highly promotable, which means she's very good looking. So this is what I would call a domestic comedy, and brought to us by the publisher Freehand, who brought us Good to a Fault. So in Ruth, we have Claudia, who's a single mom. She's got 2 children, fairly young children. I think they're about 6 and 2. And then she has a brother who has a seemingly perfect life. And the crux of the book comes about when her mother passes away quite suddenly. Her mother's only about 60 years old, and then basically it's looking at how Claudia has to really do all of the heavy lifting. So, as I said, it's sort of a domestic comedy. It's very funny. There's a great exchange between Claudia and her son when they're at her mother's funeral. And she's trying to explain to her son what's happening at the funeral when the minister says that she's her mother or grandma is on a short trip home, and he's like, well, what does that mean? And she says, well, she had the stroke when she was in a plane, so she's almost at heaven. So she's halfway to heaven, and then his response is, well, does that mean if she died in a submarine she would be halfway to hell? So that kind of conversation between Claudia and her dad, who turns out to be a hoarder, and Claudia and her kids is really quite fun all the way through the book.
A Slap in the Face. So actually, of all the books I have, this is my favorite. And this is a follow-up to another book called How to Lead a Good Life. And I put that on your sheet with the ISBN. Both of these books are about Stoic philosophy, but they're very accessible. The the first book had a chapter about insults, and now this has been expanded into a full book, but it's actually quite a small book. It's about not just insults, but teasing and bullying, but it's about adult interaction. It's not for kids or about kids. First, the author, he describes different types of insults, and it's not just direct verbal aggressive insults. He also talks about insult by omission, being left out of a group, or backbiting, gossiping. He explains why people insult each other, and I found this really enlightening. And he talks about playing the game of social hierarchy. And he also explains why we feel so hurt. So when somebody insults someone, they're trying to elevate themselves on the social hierarchy, and if you get insulted, you feel like you're being pushed down on the hierarchy. I'm really simplifying things. He takes this further and uses this idea to explain many other types of human behavior. But he also takes this idea about insult further, and he talks about Stoics, and they practice insult pacifism. So you don't strike back if someone insults you or hurts you. And anyways, he gives you many different examples, but the best is not to respond. But as I said, the most interesting part about this is how he takes this a step further, and these ideas can be taken into other situations.
So my next book is the Writing Life by George Featherling. George Featherling is a writer, a publisher, a former bookstore owner, a poet. He's pretty much done it all. And in the 70s, someone suggested that he keep a journal of his writing life. And he has an interesting quote in his book where he was like, the whole purpose of him keeping a journal was to be a release from writing. So, but within the first couple of chapters, or even the first couple of pages, the amount of people that he intersected with and drank with, there's a lot of drinking in this book, certainly Canadian writers in the 1970s and 80s, is just astounding. Everyone from Charles Taylor, Gwendolyn McEwen, Howard Angle, Greta Ponce, the list goes on and on and on. So, and he was what we can call bi-coastal. He lived primarily in Toronto, but in the past 10 or 15 years, he did move out to Vancouver, and that's where he has been sort of residing but going back and forth between Toronto. So for anyone that's interested in Canadian authors, Canadian books, again, during that very fertile time during the 70s and 80s, he writes of this amazing incident in here. He was very good friends with Margaret Atwood, and he talks about this scene, or this incident that happened. Peggy and Graham, her husband, were browsing at the shop today, browsing in the shop when I stopped in today. Peggy said that she was robbed at knife point last week on Bernard Avenue in the middle of the afternoon by two young toughs. With the blade at her throat, she gave them the money. I didn't have the courage to ask her what amount, but forced them to say a polite thank you before letting her go. Called the cops, who took 1.5 hours to arrive. Brave muggers indeed who would take on Margaret Atwood.
Okay, so I have another biography. This one's about Nilsson, and in 1968, when John Lennon and Paul McCartney had a press conference to announce the formation of Apple Corps, John was asked to name his favorite American artist, and he said Nilsson. Paul was asked to name his favorite American group, and he said Nilsson. So the Beatles were huge fans, and they became very good friends. If you haven't heard of Harry Nilsson, I'm sure you've heard his songs. He was a singer, but also he composed. He did sing, and he had quite a few hits, but he was best known as a composer. Probably his best commercial hit was One, and the first line is, "One is the loneliest number you'll ever know." And apparently he wrote it while he was listening to a busy signal on a phone, and actually if you listen to it, you can hear the busy signal in the background. So a lot of his songs were pretty sad, but he had some fun and goofy ones too, like "Put the Lime in the Coconut." He had some big hits as a singer. Without You was probably the biggest one, and it's been in lots of movies. In fact, a lot of his songs have been used for TV movies and, TV shows and movies. He had the theme from Midnight Cowboy. He had one of the key songs and all that jazz. As I said, he was greatly admired by the Beatles and a lot of other singers and songwriters, but he never really became famous because he refused to perform live. So he didn't do concerts, he didn't tour. He was a very enigmatic person. And so there's a documentary made just a couple of years ago, that's what's on the screen as well, Who is Harry Nilsson? And it was quite a hit. So reading this is like a trip through the 60s. The Beatles are a big part of it, but he also knew or performed or wrote songs for the Mamas and the Papas, Three Dog Night, the Yardbirds, the Monkees, Keith Moon, on and on and on.
So I, like many people, have read Loving Frank and The Parrot's Wife, both which I enjoyed thoroughly. But when I heard about this novel, Z, or Z as we would call it in Canada, a novel of Zelda Fitzgerald, I was so excited because Fitzgerald, out of all of those writers, was my absolute favorite. So much in the same vein as The Parrot's Wife and Loving Frank, this is looking at the perspective of that relationship, that starred relationship, from the female point of view. Now, this is different, of course, because Zelda was not as big a star as Scott was, but she certainly held her own. So it is a novel. It is based on a ton and a ton and a ton of historical research and so much fun. Like, we were all very excited to hear about this, but it absolutely did not disappoint when I read it. So Macmillan or St. Martin's has announced a pretty massive print run for this, about 150,000. And again, with The Great Gatsby coming out this May, I think it's coming out now. I think this will definitely be something that your patrons will be clamoring for. And it's already gotten a fantastic quote from Sarah Gruen.
Aging in Canada, this is part of a very important series at Oxford. It's called the Issues in Canada series, and it represents, not this book, but the whole series, the latest information on various issues affecting Canadians. So in your handout, I've given you the titles and the ISBNs for all the other books. They've all come out over the last 2 or 3 years. These are great to recommend to high school students doing research. They're full of graphs and statistics. This one has 32 tables and graphs and lots of really current statistics. This looks at the changing attitudes towards the elderly, current demographics, common health problems, disease prevention. There's a lot of information about the healthcare system in Canada and compares it to other countries. All sorts of information, including stuff about caregivers. But overall, it's quite positive because Canadians are living much longer, healthier lives.
So my next two titles are going to be YA books that could definitely be read by adults. I know at Toronto Public Library, about 15% of the books that go out in the teen collection are actually held by people with adult cards. So, and as we know from the success of things like The Hunger Games and Harry Potter, like definitely adults are reading teen books. Siege and Storm is the second book in the Grisha trilogy, and this was another one that we were all very excited to see. So the first book, Shadow and Bone, has already been on the New York Times bestseller list. And this book, I do think, is even more interesting and exciting than the first book. So it features two characters. There's the main character, Alina, and so she's a kick-butt girl with the special powers, and then she has a special romance with a young fellow at her side, Mal. So Alina has these pretty amazing powers that the Dark Prince is trying to get his hands on and contain. So there's lots of great action in here. I sort of likened it. You can tell from the cover, they didn't really do this on the cover of the first book, but there's kind of a Russian bent to it, like a lot of the names come from Russian culture, but it really felt a bit like Game of Thrones, but without the incest. Oh, and the next book's mine too. Okay, so Francesca Leah Block. So this book follows a lot, or really, it was funny, I read my first book, The Whispering Muse, and then quite soon after, I read Love in the Time of Global Warming. And both of these features, and I didn't even realize that I put them sort of top and bookended them, but sort of feature the Odysseus myth. So in this one, it is a post-apocalyptic tale, so the end of the world has basically just happened, and Pen, or Penelope, is a teenager, and she has managed to survive, so she is on a quest to go and search out her family, her lost brother and mother and father, who she still has a faint hope that they are alive. So what Block has done in this book is really taken all the trials that they do in the Odyssey and match them up, but in a very sort of modern way, that Pen has to overcome these challenges to hopefully find her mother, father, and brother. So a great read, really a lot of fun. Had me racing back to reread some of the basic the basic stories from ancient Greek, Roman, and myths, stuff like that. So anyway, so that was a lot of fun. So that's it for all of our books. We hope you enjoyed it. We hope you all found something to read. So don't forget to check us out on our website, where we blog a couple of times a week, Twitter, Pinterest, and Facebook.